Learn Hebrew. Don't be afraid. Today we are talking all about how to make commands in Hebrew. Shalom everyone, and welcome back to Hebrew Grammar Help. Today we are talking all about how to form commands in Hebrew, what linguists and grammarians call the imperative mood. So Hebrew imperatives are not that difficult, but you do need to know the future tense in order to form the imperative. Sometimes they just plain use the future tense. Other times the imperative is based on the future tense. So either way, it's really going to be important that you know the future tense first. Commands always involve the second person, that is the you person. And in standard English, we basically just have one form of that, right? You. But a lot of dialects do have a way to make a plural you, like y'all or you guys, yuns. Now, there is a thing called the cohortative, and this is sometimes also referred to as like first person commands. And in some languages, they teach it together with all of the other imperatives. We're not going to do that here. I will make a separate video for that one. So all of the commands in this video are going to involve a you person. And so in Hebrew, we're going to have three different forms. We're going to have the masculine, the feminine, and the plural. Now this plural is officially the plural masculine, and there is a separate form for the plural feminine, but I have never actually heard it in use. And I've never seen it in use except in songs. So there's a pretty famous song called Sena, or sometimes it's called Sena, Sena, Sena. And that means go out. And it's talking to the young women of Israel, saying, go out and get yourself a soldier boyfriend. So the whole song is Sena, Sena, Sena. So that ena ending is the official feminine plural future and imperative ending. But like I said, I have never heard it actually used when somebody is just talking, and I've never seen it written, except in the Tanakh. So it's not uncommon for a language to have a different way to form positive commands versus negative commands. So of course, positive commands are like, do something, whereas negative commands is don't do something. And the negative commands are super simple, so we're going to start with that. To form a negative command in Hebrew, all you have to do is write or say the word al, which is spelled Aleph Lamed, and that's the not part of it, the do not do something. And then the next part is just going to be the future tense of whatever the appropriate person is. So if I want to say, don't speak English in Hebrew class, it depends who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to one guy, it's going to be al tedaber anglit. If it's one gal, I'm going to say al tedabri anglit. And if I'm talking to the whole class, I'm going to say al tedabru anglit. And that's it for negative commands. Al plus the proper future form. Positive commands are a little bit more complicated, but they're really not that bad. In practice, for most verbs, you are just simply going to use the future tense of the correct person. And so it's just going to be like the negative command minus the word al, because of course now this is a positive command. So one thing I hear all the time is when my teachers are trying to get me or somebody in the class to tell them something. And so they'll say tagidli for a guy. They'll say tagidili if they're talking to me or another gal. Or they'll say tagiduli, which means tell me to the whole group. And these forms, tagid, tagidi, tagidu, they're all the future tense of the verb lehagid. But in more formal contexts, such as a textbook that has instructions or maybe even a speech, you might actually see the imperative forms. It's good to know them even if you never intend to use them, because then you'll recognize what you're seeing. I've noticed that whenever I use a textbook for my son that's intended for Israeli kids, all of the instructions for how to do an activity are written using the actual imperative form as opposed to the future tense, like what you would hear when people are talking to each other. So, how do we make the imperative form? Well, there's one method for pa'al and pl, and then there's another method for hif'il, hitpa'el, and nif'al. Pu'al and huf'al are strictly passive verbs. They are the passive of pl and hif'il. And so even though they are considered a completely separate binyan, they are not like full service binyanim. They are lacking in the infinitive. They do not have an infinitive form, and they also don't have command forms. So they will be missing from this video. Nif'al can be the passive of pa'al verbs, but there are a lot of nif'al verbs that don't actually correspond to a pa'al verb, and they have a very active sense about them. And so they are a full, complete binyan. They have an infinitive, and they also have imperative forms. So since we're not talking about pu'al and huf'al, we've got 5 binyanim that we're going to talk about today. And as I mentioned, 2 of them are going to follow one pattern and 3 of them are going to follow the other pattern. So now I'm going to show you a few tables, and in all of these tables, I'm going to follow Pealim.com's method of showing all of the words with nikud and written in ktiv chaser. And then if any word is spelled differently without nikud, then that will also be listed in the table underneath the version that has nikud. So if you see 2 words in a box, that's why you see that. Look at the second one and you'll see how it's actually spelled when we write things. But I wanted to include the nikud because I'm talking a lot about pronunciation and vowels, and so I wanted it all to be there on the screen for you. So for pa'al and pl verbs, you simply take the correct form of the future tense and you remove that taf prefix, and voila! Well, almost. There are 2 minor complications that can arise when we remove that taf. The first applies to all pa'al and pl verbs whose shoresh starts with a begad kafat letter, or to be a little more accurate, whose shoresh starts with a bet, a kaf, or a pei. The other begad kafat letters are gimel, daled, and taf, but in the most common dialects of Hebrew, they do not sound different when they have a dagesh versus not having a dagesh. And since we don't write with nikud, the important thing is to know how to pronounce it. And so it really only affects the bet, the kaf, and the pei. So in both pa'al and pl verbs, the first shoresh letter does not have a dagesh when it is in the future tense. But when we remove the taf, now that first shoresh letter is the first letter of the word. If any word starts with a begad kfat letter, it has to have a dagesh in it. And so we need to remember to say that bet, kaf, or pei with its plosive pronunciation. So like a B, like a K, or like a P sound. And not like the fricative that we hear in the future tense, which is the V sound, the Ch sound, and the F sound. So I found a shoresh that starts with kaf that is available in all of the binyanim, and that's kaf taf bet, which is has to do with writing and inscribing. So in the Pa'al, the future tense is going to be tichtov, but the imperative is going to be ketov. And in the PL, the future will be techatev, but the imperative will be katev. There's one other minor complication, and this only affects Pa'al verbs, and that is that when we remove the taf prefix with the feminine and the future forms, we can sometimes get a situation where a word would want to start with two schwas. So the first two letters would both have a schwa under them, and that is illegal in Hebrew. And so what happens is that very first schwa converts to an E, a chirik, and so it sounds like an E sound. So this affects the feminine and the plural forms of the imperative of most of the gzarot of Pa'al verbs. Ayin Yod and Ayin Vav are the big exception. There might be others, but I can't think of any. But that's one big exception. So when we look at all three forms here, we see that the Ata form is just tichtov and then ketov for the imperative. So no problem there. But when we have the at form, it's tichtevi. And so after we convert that chaf to a kaf, we would have ketevi. And that's two schwas in a row, it can't be. So it's going to become kitvi. And same thing with the atem form. We're going to have tichtevu, and since we can't say kitevu, it's going to be kitvu. And this is not an issue with PL verbs, because in the future of PL, it's the taf prefix that has a schwa, and the first letter of the shoresh always has a patach. So when we remove that taf, then our first letter always has a patach under it, so no problem there. So with this verb, we have future techatev and then imperative katev. And for the at form, it's going to be techatvi, and then the imperative is going to be katvi. And for the atem form, it's going to be techatvu, and the imperative will be katvu. So hif'il, hitpa'el, and nif'al all have an even easier system. What happens is the taf prefix becomes a hey prefix. And then we're done. And it's easy to remember which verbs this applies to, because hif'il and hitpa'el and nif'al all have a hey in their infinitive form. So we would have something like lehaktiv, lehitkatev, and lehikatev. And the hif'il ata form also gets a weird vowel. Instead of that chirik that makes hif'il sound like hif'il, that last vowel is going to be a tsere. So the hif'il future is tachtiv, tachtivi, tachtivu. But the imperative is hachtev, hachtivi, hachtivu. So you hear that different vowel in the ata form. Hitpa'el and nif'al don't have any weird vowel change like that. So all you do is you change that taf into a hey, and you're done. So for hitpa'el, we have titkatev, titkatvi, titkatvu. And in the imperative, it's hitkatev, hitkatvi, hitkatvu. And for nif'al, we have tikatev, tikatvi, tikatvu. And the imperative is hikatev, hikatvi, hikatvu. Now, I mentioned that for most verbs in casual speech, you just use the future tense when you are making a command. But there are a handful of verbs that is not the case. Even in the most casual of speech, most people use the actual imperative form. So here's a list of verbs that most people will use the regular imperative in everyday speech. This is definitely not a complete list, and I think it may, it may change from person to person. I think anyone can use the imperative with any verb if they want to. They just might sound maybe a little stuffy or a little formal if they use it when talking among friends. So all of these verbs have two things in common. One of them is that they are pretty common verbs, but also they all also have some irregularity about them in the future tense and thus in also the command form. So the top three on this list have a letter that drops out in the future tense. And so of course it drops out in the imperative as well. Lashevet means to sit, and the shoresh is yod shin bet. And so you can see that the yod has dropped out. So in the future, we have teshev, teshvi, teshvu, and in the imperative, it's shev, shvi, shvu. The shoresh of latet is nun taf nun. And in the future tense, the first nun drops out. And so we have titan, titni, titnu. And in the imperative, we're going to have ten, tni, and tnu. And the shoresh of lalechet is hey, lamed, kaf. And the hey drops out. So we have telech, telchi, telchu for the future tense. And for the imperative, we have lech, lechi, lechu. The bottom three verbs on this list are either ayin vav or ayin yod verbs. So I do think that it's probable that Israelis will use the regular imperative for other verbs that are like this, other ayin vav, ayin yod verbs in the pa'al binyan. But it's just not so common, and especially when you have a rule that is not a hard and fast rule, it's more of a preferential usage. It's really hard to find a hard and fast list of all of the verbs that are preferred to be used in a certain way. And so here we have lavo, which means to come, and in the future it's tavo, tavoi, tavou, and in the imperative it's bo, boi, bou. And lazuz means to move, and so we have in the future tazuz, tazuzi, tazuzu, and in the imperative zuz, zuzi, zuzu. Lasim means to put, and so you can say put something there, but also I hear this one so often when a teacher is asking the students to pay attention. And to say to pay attention in Hebrew, it's lasim lev. It's like put your heart, right? Kind of put your heart to this thing that I'm about to tell you. And so future tense, tasim, tasimi, tasimu, and the imperative sim, simi, simu. Hey friends, right after I did this video and then uploaded it, I actually took a class that explained all of this stuff about the imperative. So I was reminded of 4 extra words that we use the imperative on a regular basis. And so first of all, I want to say that I was right about the ayin vav and ayin yod verbs, that you can definitely always use the imperative for those because they're so short and succinct. I think that's why. So we got other verbs like lakum, larutz, lashir, verbs like that were given as examples. And the other thing is that there were 4 extra verbs that are of the other class that basically their first letter, their first shoresh letter, drops out in the future tense. And so it's also not there in the imperative, and therefore it gets used much more. And so here are the 4 verbs. They are laredet, and so we say red, redi, redu, and that means to get down. And then there's also latzet, which means to exit or go out, and that's tse, tsei, tseu. And then we have linsoa, which means to go by vehicle, and so it's sa, sei, seu. And the last one is לקחת, which means to take. And that's קח, קחי, קחו. So I just wanted to insert those because they are verbs that I have heard many times used in this particular way. I do not usually hear the Israelis use the future when they are trying to make a command with these 4 particular verbs. So I wanted to include them here. Now remember, if you want to tell somebody not to do any of these verbs, you are going to use the future tense. You're going to use the al plus the future tense, just like with all of the other verbs. So that's it for today. It's really not that complicated, and especially when you realize that except for these last 6 verbs that I just mentioned, you basically can use the future tense for everything. As always, if you have any questions or feedback, please leave it in the comments. And if you have any aspect of Hebrew grammar that has you flummoxed, leave that in the comments and I will do my best to make a video about it. Hit like if you enjoyed this video and subscribe and hit the notification bell if you want to see more. Lahitrawut papa ama ba'a. See you next time.